Hello, and many thanks for the introduction, and many thanks above all to the organizers for inviting me. In this colloquium on the City of God and its early reception, I'm particularly happy to discuss some of my findings on the marginal annotations made to manuscripts of that work before the 10th century. We've already heard Marina speak about some of these manuscripts, but I thought I would begin by briefly introducing the material, its potential, and the associated challenges. I will then demonstrate how a quantitative analysis of the material may be used to suggest shifts in the interests of readers from late antiquity to the Carolingian period. I will conclude the paper by taking a closer look at some of the methods and interests of these early annotators. I hope to demonstrate what studying these annotations can contribute to an understanding of early readings of the work and of the period's intellectual history more broadly. The annotations in the early manuscripts of the City of God mainly consist of topic markers recording the topic of a passage, short summaries repeating the main points of the text, and signs such as nota registering interest in a passage. There are also annotations registering quotations of biblical and classical texts, and occasionally approbations, indicating a reader's valuation of a passage. Unlike glosses to school texts, these annotations are not especially interested in language beyond occasionally suggesting variant readings. Many of these types of annotations can tell us about the issues readers found interesting and the ways they interpreted the meaning of individual passages. The greatest challenge in working with this material is contextualization. Only rarely can the creation of text sets of annotations be localized, and dating is often rough and uncertain. Indeed, annotations to an authoritative text such as the City of God were often copied from an earlier exemplar with the main text. I have strived mainly to distinguish Carolingian annotations from pre-Carolingian ones, and even this is not possible in every case. I have recorded a total of 9,904 annotations in the pre-10th century manuscripts of the City of God. Due to their number, I have explored quantitative methods for analysis. One is to plot the number of annotations against the pages of the Lombard and Calv edition in the Corpus Christianorum. Some of you have seen me present this kind of graph at previous occasions. One big problem here is that this kind of graph is easily skewed by a few manuscripts that have very many more annotations than most of the others. If we separate Carolingian and pre-Carolingian annotations to different graphs, we should be able to compare how interests of readers may have shifted in time. However, as I mentioned, it's not always possible to date these annotations precisely. I have thus applied a weighting system to manage this uncertainty. When counting how many times a page was annotated before the Carolingian period, an annotation I regard as certainly pre-Carolingian is counted once, whereas an annotation that is only probably of that date is counted on only 0.75 times, and an annotation I cannot date with any probability is counted as 0.5. Whereas an annotation that could be pre-Carolingian but probably isn't is counted as 0.25, and certainly Carolingian annotations are not counted at all. When counting Carolingian annotations, this system is then reversed. The result naturally no longer represents any real number of times a page was annotated, but rather a probability. Then, to counter the distortion of thickly annotated manuscripts, we can simply count how many times a page of the edition is annotated at least once, employing the weighting I described. I present here two graphs of the annotations in the first 10 books. Since these are far better represented in the material, there is a much smaller number of especially probably pre-Carolingian annotations to the second half of the book, so that comparisons become more difficult. The probably pre-Carolingian annotations cluster in the first 5 books. To see which are the truly outstanding peaks, I concentrate on those within the 95th percentile. In the first book, these peaks include page 3, with Augustine's remark that Rome's gods are those of Troy, which means that they have already been vanquished, and that includes many quotations from Virgil. Pages 7, 10, 16, and 23, with discussions of divine providence and human suffering, including the case of Marcus Regulus, whom the gods let suffer, although he only did as they commanded. And page 33, where Romulus and Remus are noted as having instituted asylum, and where Augustine introduces the idea that the two cities are mixed in this world. In Book 2, the most annotated pages are 39, where Augustine asks whether the festivals of gods teach virtue and notes that philosophers were not accorded divine honors, and page 45 on the depravities of theatre and the poets. The most annotated pages include 75 in the third book on the mythical early king Numa and the tears of the Cumaean Apollo. Pre-Carolingian readers were also interested in the definition of just rule and the famous response of the pirate to Alexander the Great on page 101. And Augustine's discussion of the gods and the protection of empires through the case of the Assyrian Empire on page 104, which also begins his list of ridiculous or shameful Roman gods. After Book 1, Book 5 gets most of the most annotated pages. These are page 136, and discussing faith using Homer and quoting Cicero on foreknowledge. Examples of Roman virtue on pages 151 and 153, and page 161, which comments on Constantine and other 4th century emperors. When we then look at the pages that Carolingian readers most often annotated, we see some continuity, with pages 7, 10, and 27 showing continuing interest in the first book's discussions on providence, suffering, and the problem of suicide. But judging by these annotations, the interests of Carolingian readers have subtly shifted. Among the most annotated pages, we find 53 and 54 with Augustine's discussions of Scipio's definition of a republic, and page 108 with a list of Roman gods. There's a marked interest in the fifth book's discussions of God's omniscience and man's free will, as the most annotated pages include 135 on astrology and fate, and 140 and 141 where Augustine discusses Cicero's arguments and then argues that individual agency and responsibility are compatible with God's foreknowledge. There's also a peek at page 155 with a discussion on virtues and depraved rulers. Finally, the most annotated pages before the Carolingian period were all in the first 5 books, but the most annotated Carolingian pages include also those from books 9 and 10. These are page 254, discussing scriptural versus Stoic views of the passions, pages 256 and 259 on the demonology of the Neoplatonic philosopher Apuleius, and page 267 on demons and angels, page 276 on the proper worship of God, to whom alone all adoration and sacrifice are due, and page 287 on the created order and miracles. Assuming these shifts are real, it is of course possible to suggest reasons for them. For example, the Carolingian interest in discussions of faith and foreknowledge may well reflect the later 9th century debates on double predestination. And the interest in Augustine's ideas on rulers and the Republic may well reflect the fact that the Carolingians had a Roman Empire with its attendant problems. Such hypotheses need to be tested by looking at what the annotations to these pages are doing, of course. One focus of interest that runs through the whole material is pre-Christian Roman religion. This is also a subject that clearly produced anxiety in some readers, quite apart from the fact that Augustine is of course witheringly critical of the pre-Christian beliefs he discusses. On the other hand, some annotations just draw attention to these issues, less to what Augustine says about them. One example of this is these annotations entered by a contemporary reader to a 6th century manuscript. Whereas Augustine's purpose here is to ridicule the gods by listing all the small and arguably demeaning roles traditional religion assigned to the gods, the annotator appears interested in enumerating their names. Although the annotator acknowledges Augustine's point that it is ridiculous to entrust Rome to such gods, they then go on to note the names in the margins and on further pages the aliases and roles of these gods. It's almost as if Augustine's text is used as a quarry for such details on Roman deities. However, when the annotations transmit explicit reactions to this material, it is clear that it caused anxiety. This also brings up an important aspect of early reading of Augustine's works. This is because in such cases the annotators appear anxious on behalf of other readers, and in this way make visible the fact that at least sometimes these works were not annotated only for private edification or research, but for the benefit of others. This is seen, for example, in what I have called the Gassia series of copied annotations transmitted in several Carolingian manuscripts. These include quotations from Isidor's etymologies, and so at least in their transmitted state must post-date the early 7th century. Their creation may also be roughly localized, since one references a Gassia, pictured here, who broke the idols of Vascones. Alain Stocklet argued that this refers to Gascons as the inhabitants of Aquitaine, and suggested that the note was written in Clermont, where a Saint Cassius was venerated as its first martyr. These probably Merovingian annotations are very interested in various Roman issues. In fact, they suggest that Roman past was still in many ways present. They also address a reader, suggesting that they were composed to guide a reader throughout the book. They call the reader's attention to scribal faults and insufficient punctuation, to Augustine's narrative of the two cities, to a particularly ingenious assertion against Roman theology of history, and to a discussion of the cruelty of the devil, this last in the context of Augustine's discussion of theatre. Here, pre-Christian culture appears interesting in spite of being depraved. Augustine's discussion of theatre is thickly annotated, not only to establish its history, but above all to emphasize its corrupt nature. But there's a clear need also, and an interest in establishing what theatre in fact was. So a clarifying annotation expands on the meanings of theatrical plays. And the annotator has consulted Isidor's etymologies on this subject and supplies from there a description of comedy and tragedy in charged language. A further note tells that histriones are actors that dress in female clothing to act the roles of immodest women. Finally, a note refers to the reader interested in theatre to the preceding annotations, which will make plain the disgraces of theatre. Another example of anxiety about the pagan past and of annotations written to manage this is provided by the series transmitted in this copy of the first 8 books of the City of God. This was made in the late 9th century in an unidentified northern Frankish center and carries over 200 annotations. From their often corrupt text, it is clear that the annotations are copies. 2 annotations to Book 5, moreover, allow dating and localizing them with unusual precision. They mark passages as relevant to a Liberius and a Parthenius. The only known context in which we find prominent men with these names together is Arles in Provence under Gothic rule. The annotations would thus appear to have originated in an early 6th century community at Arles, perhaps in the circle of Bishop Caesarius himself. In any case, the annotations reflect concerns about paganism, as on the one hand they frequently mark Augustine's rebuttals of pagan beliefs with approbations and calls for attention. On the other, because they signal Augustine's discussions of Roman gods as fabulous or fictional, fabulosum. These annotations reflect a need to clearly distinguish in Augustine's text what are the passages that reflect his wholesome doctrine and which not. For example, at chapter 9 of book 6, here on the right, beside a passage where Augustine ridicules the Christian religion by listing all the deities associated with sex and procreation, we read, "You who are weak, skip here until another sign, so you do not become weaker still." Clearly, it is the pre-Christian deities that are disturbingly fabulous, and probably sex especially that was not conducive to all readers' attempts at controlling their thoughts. After this review of 3 sets of pre-Carolingian annotations, I wish to draw attention to some Carolingian annotations. Although Carolingian annotators were also interested in pre-Christian religion, I want to shift focus and look at a particularly Carolingian preoccupation, and this is double predestination. This was widely debated in the 3rd quarter of the 9th century. Gottschalk of Orbais famously thought that God had predestined humans to either salvation or damnation. This was an Augustinian idea, but many bishops felt it to be dangerous, especially because it was understood to undermine Carolingian social order, built on personal responsibility and the fear of damnation. Warren Peze has recently shown that the controversy was so long-lived and vehement, partly because Gottschalk's ideas and the issue of predestination interested monks and lower clergy. Among other evidence, he points to marginal annotations in copies of texts discussed in the controversy. His evidence includes 3 copies of the City of God. In Brussels 9641, a Tironian hickmark signals a passage that Gottschalk cites on predestination to damnation. Other readers of that same manuscript, perhaps from Corby, reflect a general interest in predestination and free will, but that unobtrusive sign is the only indication of interest specifically in double predestination. The same passage is annotated in the East Frankish Latin 12215 with that just as the Church does not pray for the devil, it would not pray for those predestined to the eternal fire if it knew in this life who they were. There's also a hand that marks in Bouge 94 a defense of Gottschalk's concept of trina deitas. It's easy to provide further examples. Peze also discussed annotations connected with Pacificus of Verona, but not in any copy of the City of God. However, the 5th century copy of books 11 through 16 in Verona manuscript 28-26 of the Bibliotheca Capitolare also has annotations attributed to Pacificus. The fact that the annotations perhaps represent the work of multiple Veronese annotators and not necessarily the hand of the celebrated archdeacon does not detract it of their interest. Beze points out that Gottschalk visited Verona in the 840s and preached there on double predestination, a few years before he landed in trouble with the Carolingian bishops. So the Veronese clergy likely had first-hand knowledge of his ideas. At any rate, engagement with the idea of predestination is indeed suggested by these annotations. Many of them note the general themes of predestination and free will. Perhaps tellingly, an annotation to Book 11 that most clearly connects with double predestination has at some point been erased, that God foreknows in both ways. Finally, a late 9th century hand annotates double predestination in Book 15 in Leiden Vossianus Latinus, folio 6. With these cases, I hope to have demonstrated 2 points. The first relates to how these annotations can be used to study intellectual history. The annotations on predestination, for example, offer additional support to Beze's thesis that the controversy was widely followed. They show several Carolingian readers investigating controversial issues for themselves. In demonstrating that readers recognize the theme central to an ongoing discussion in Augustine's text, they help to flesh out the intellectual context of this discussion. The other point relates to the nature of the City of God as a text for these early readers. I think it's useful to recognize that some early readers saw this as a dangerous text, or at least parts of it. While authoritative and worthy of reverence, not all of it was suited to all readers, as the annotations trying to help readers to navigate the word suggest the rich contents of the City of God could be, for some, too rich. Thank you.